I now invite Professor Hans Alma to set forth the grounds on which a decision to confer an honorary doctorate on Professor Amartya Sen is based, and after that, Professor Hank Manschot will continue the ceremony.
Dear Professor Amartya Sen, the University of Humanistic Studies, through its Department of Globalization Studies, represented by myself, and the Cosmopolis Institute, represented by Professor Henk Manschot, is privileged to confer an honorary doctorate on you. It is my honor to present this laudatory speech, after which Professor Manschot will proceed with the kappa. Your curriculum vitae reveals that you have received more than 100 honorary degrees. This staggering number confirms that universities across the world recognize and acknowledge the exceptional and guiding importance of your work. Knowing this, we highly appreciate the fact that you have agreed to accept our honorary degree in person. Thank you for traveling all the way to what is perhaps the smallest, but also most unique university in the world, given its public humanist basis and mission. Your acceptance of our honorary degree enables us to publicly express our tremendous appreciation for you as a person and for your entire work. Your presence also enables us to highlight the significance of your work for humanistic studies in the 21st century. In order to do so, I will focus on a specific theme that runs throughout your work, namely the intrinsic relation between justice, democracy, and plurality or pluralism. In your central focus on justice as the key value in a humane society, you ask how injustice throughout the world can be redressed. In your approach, you advocate active participation of citizens and a recognition of what you famously termed what people have reason to value. Characteristically, your idea of justice is grounded in a basic trust in human beings and their preparedness to reason, even in difficult and conflictual circumstances. This presupposes an innate relationship between the search for justice and the search for democracy. For you, democracy requires a solid process of public reasoning and governance through deliberative practices. Your approach starts from the actual lives and freedoms of people, whereby norms, laws, and institutions play an important role, but where the main focus is on honoring and promoting active citizenship and public reasoning as the road towards a more just society. Here, you also express your appreciation for the work of local and global civil society organizations and activists. For humanism and humanistic studies in the 21st century, your focus on the intrinsic connection between justice and democracy is of vital importance. Humanism as a worldview and humanistic studies as an academic multidiscipline both share your dedication to the development of just societies where all people can live meaningful lives. Your insistence that justice can be promoted through participatory processes rooted in actual circumstances teaches us that humanism and humanistic studies are optimistic but realistic endeavors, which are worth pursuing. While the notion of democracy expresses political dimensions of public reasoning and public participation, your ideas about pluralism and plurality articulate its cultural dimensions. Throughout your work, you emphasize the central value of cultural diversity and the diversity of moral and spiritual traditions when we deliberate on a global idea of justice. Explicitly, you encourage the contemporary heirs of the European Enlightenment to broaden their horizon and study what other cultural traditions foreground in terms of values and commitments. Across the world, key values and traditions of democracy, freedom, and justice are grounded in long, diverse, and rich histories, which are no less meaningful than those expressed within the traditions of the European Enlightenment. It is a pleasure to read how you keep finding subtle, ironic, and humorous ways to remind us of the breadth and depth of other cultures as a way to address Western arrogance. But your plea for pluralism and plurality goes further. You show us that even after giving serious consideration to distinct and contrary arguments and analysis coming from different quarters, it is still possible to disagree about what justice entails. There are differences that cannot be eradicated by a greater universal ideal of justice. This is why you opt for a strong comparative empirical approach. At the University of Humanistic Studies, we appreciate how you seek to connect cultural pluralism and justice in both local and global contexts within your open and effectively rich concept of public reasoning. In your book, Identity and Violence, you focus on identity and cultural pluralism. Here, you warn us against, I quote, the insistence on a choiceless singularity of human identity, which, in your own words, not only dismisses us all, but also makes the world much more flammable. In humanistic studies, we highly value your idea that the main hope of harmony in our troubled world lies in the plurality of our identities. For the last 10 years, together with the Humanist Institute for Cooperation with Developing Countries, HIVOS, we have conducted a month-long intensive annual summer school with groups of graduate students, NGO staff, and activists from Uganda, South Africa, India, Indonesia, and the Netherlands. In this school, we not only focus on academic literature, but also live together and thus experience the richness, but also the difficult challenges of plurality in a context of shared human dignity. Your work on plurality and pluralism and your appeal to value diversity inspires us both in our teaching and in our research programs, particularly in our research group on globalization and pluralism. Here, we don't use pluralism in a neutral sense. We believe that pluralism entails more than tolerance and differs from relativism, because it involves an active search for understanding that transcends boundaries of differences without denying the value of these differences. In the years to come, we hope to develop our research program on pluralism in ways that do justice to the powerful, important, and inspiring contribution you give to this field. For all these reasons, and I could mention many more, we are so grateful, so proud and happy to confer an honorary doctorate degree on you.
Propotestate legibus nobis concessa, ex autoritate magistrorum universitatis studiorum humanisticorum collegi decreto, ego Henk Manschot te Amartya Sen, propter insignia tua merita, doctorum honoris causa, pronuncio atque declaro, inque te confero omne ius omniaque privilegia, que legibus famoribus doctoribus rite creatis constituta sunt.
Honorable Rector and other friends, I feel, of course, extremely privileged, moved, honored to be here, both for the kindness that this great university is showing to me, and also, if I may say, for being in such distinguished company on this occasion. I feel very blessed and privileged. I'd also like to thank very much the very kind citation of Professor Hans Alma, and I'm very moved and I'm very grateful, and also even the Latin speech that I followed, to the extent I followed it, I thought was reason for to be pleased and happy, and I should cultivate my Latin a bit more and go deeper into it. I'm actually very privileged also for being here, because at one stage it looked I won't really make it, because yesterday when I was in an airplane leaving Boston, it abandoned its flight, and we went back to the airport, and I got a rather terrifying discussion from an engineer who was traveling also in the same compartment from General Motors, and who explained that that particular engine which they examined, and as they tried to examine it, apparently the core of it broke into two parts completely. And he said that if this happened in the air, the consequences would have been rather disastrous. So then suddenly, rather than being only unhappy at being delayed, I felt rather happy that I was still here. Of course, one consequence, since I had to take a later plane and make the connection, and came in the middle of the ceremony, for which I had to apologize. I think the lack of sleep might be rather painfully evident in my case. But I would like to reassure you that only once in my life, exactly once, I had fallen asleep while giving a lecture. That happened many years ago at SUNY State University of New York in Buffalo, and rather similar circumstances, I might say. It's very difficult. People try to, when you ask how long did I sleep, they tend to assure you that it wasn't clear that they noticed anything at all. This was a gathering of philosophers. And I didn't expect the philosophers to be candid, so I did find ultimately an econometrician. And I asked him, I said, how long exactly did I sleep? And he said, barely 2 minutes. So that at least gave me some numerical measure. So I'll try not to match that record today. Well, I've been asked to speak about I also wanted to say how privileged I felt when I came in. I did hear the acceptance of the winner of the Leo Polak Thesis Prize, and it was very good for me to hear that. And really wonderful music, which we've all been enjoying so much. So I'm sure I'll speak up on behalf of everyone to say how much we like the music and the subject matter also that were covered in this wonderful creations. Well, I've been asked to speak about new directions of research in the use of the capabilities perspective, both in the epistemology of human flourishing and the ethics of public policy making. In a recent book, The Idea of Justice, published in 2009, I've tried to argue that our understanding of the idea of justice and of its conceptual as well as practical implications demands some fairly radical departures from the mainstream theories of human prosperity and of social justice that are dominant at the present time. The ongoing philosophy of justice is too strongly dependent on a particular way of thinking that was largely initiated by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, which concentrates on identifying perfectly just social arrangements and take the characterization of quote-unquote just institutions to be the principal and often the only identified task of the theory of justice. This way of seeing justice is woven in different ways around the idea of a hypothetical, quote-unquote, social contract. A hypothetical contract that the population of a sovereign state are supposed to be party to. Major contributions were made in this line of thinking, not only by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, and later by John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant, among others. The contractarian approach has become the dominant influence in contemporary political philosophy, led by the most prominent, and I believe the finest, political philosopher, even though we disagree, finest political philosopher of our time, namely John Rawls, whose classic book, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, presents a definitive statement on the social contract approach to justice. The Hobbesian roots of Rawlsian theory are not difficult to detect. In contrast, a number of other Enlightenment theorists, Adam Smith, the Marquis de Condorcet, Mary Wollstonecraft, possibly the most under-recognized philosopher of the 18th century, Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, and others, took a variety of approaches in the Enlightenment tradition, but it differed, and they differed many ways from each other, but they shared a common interest in making comparison between different ways in which people's lives may go, jointly influenced by the working of institutions, but not just that, people's actual behavior, their social interactions, and other factors that significantly impact on what actually happens. The analytical and rather mathematical discipline of social choice theory, which had its origin in the works of French mathematicians in the 18th century, in particular Condorcet, but also others like Borda, and that's a discipline which is very relevant to it. And I must confess that I have been personally very involved in the development and use of social choice theory, including the exploration of the constructive possibilities that the approach about how society is going, the assessment of that is pursued. In the book Idea of Justice, I've discussed how the approach of social choice theory, in contrast with the social contract approach, can help the pursuit of public reasoning aimed at the removal of injustice in the actual world in which we live. And I was very pleased that Professor Ansar Alma emphasized the importance of the reasoning issue. The task of the theory of justice in this approach is not that of speculating and dreaming about a perfectly just world, or even about perfectly just institutions, but using public scrutiny to arrive at agreed diagnosis of manifest injustices on the elimination of which a reasoned agreement could emerge. We may not agree on what a perfectly just society would look like, but we could agree that there are manifest injustices which we must give priority to removing, changing over time. What one said, it might have been abolition of slavery. Our challenges are different today, but there's always concern on which we could agree, even without agreeing, what a perfectly just world would look like. In focusing on the evaluation of the actual lives that people are able to lead, the question that immediately arises is how to understand the richness and poverty in our respective lives. The capability approach focuses on the freedoms that people actually enjoy. It is useful to begin by discussing in what way this approach is distinctive. The focus on freedoms and capabilities differs sharply from many other approaches to assessing the demands of justice. For example, looking for the fulfillment of certain formal rights, certain legal rights that people should have, on which institutional libertarians tend to focus. Whether or not these rights can be actually exercised, the question is, do they have these rights? And whether or not they can use it is a separate issue, and in which the basic approach is not very involved. Many of these rights can, of course, have an instrumental role in advancing more free social lives, and that we must acknowledge. But the pursuit of justice cannot surely stop there. It is, for example, nice and reassuring to know that neither the state nor anyone else would prevent a destitute from having a good holiday in Monaco or Acapulco. But the society may have to do a bit more beyond securing the individual's right to do what they can do on their own, and consider what the society can reasonably do to facilitate the freedom of the people to achieve what they have reason to value and treasure. It's important not to be restricted by confining the understanding of freedom within the narrow limits of institutional libertarianism, important though within its terms. Libertarianism, maybe we have to go way beyond that. But there are other pitfalls to avoid as well. The need to go beyond the mental metrics of utilities in the form of pleasure or desire fulfillment is surely another important issue. The evaluative exercise of taking note of people's actual freedoms cannot be avoided by concentrating instead only on some features of mental reactions, such as pleasures, happiness, or desire fulfillment, as utilitarians from Jeremy Bentham onwards have proposed. John Stuart Mill was in fact an exception to this. Even though he was a utilitarian, he was an exceptional utilitarian in this respect, in not accepting the point I just made, mainly because Mill was much more than a utilitarian. In fact, I learned from Richard Reeves's excellent biography of John Stuart Mill, and it is a very excellent biography, that Mill was actually very tempted to be a narrowly Benthamite utilitarian when he was 15. And 15 does seem like a good age to be a dedicated utilitarian. Even if chronically deprived persons, for example, the hopelessly poor, or the chronically unemployed, or the subjugated housewives, learn to come to terms with and accept, ultimately cheerfully, because of necessity, their deprived lifestyles, and indeed underprivileged people without hope of liberation often try to do just that, to cope with the inescapability of the deprivation involved. That cultivated cheerfulness does not eliminate the real deprivation from which they will continue to suffer as long as their freedoms are denied. In pursuing the perspective of freedom, there are, of course, many difficulties to be addressed and many problems to be resolved. Indeed, freedom has many aspects, many faces, and it's necessary both to distinguish between them and to choose the focus of analysis depending on the nature of the problem that is being addressed. For example, in dealing with the issue of torture and its unacceptability as a means to others, allegedly more important ends, pursued, I fear, in the contemporary world right now today by many powers, including some leaders of the global establishment. What would be particularly important is to see the relevance here of the classical libertarian aspects of freedom, arguing for the immunity of every human being from forcible infliction of pain and humiliation by others, including the state. This too can be partly fitted into the capability perspective, but it greatly predates the modern development of the capability approach, and its concern goes well beyond checking who has which capability altogether into the causal influences that leads to capability deprivation in each particular case, giving some special importance to the avoidance of tyranny by others. The need for and the possibility of integrating liberties in this sense with other social priorities have received a good deal of analytical attention in contemporary social choice theory as well, pointing to feasibilities as well as barriers that have to be overcome. There is greater relevance of other aspects of freedom when the focus is different, when the focus is instead on, say, issues of economic and social advantage and disadvantage, and in general on the inequality of the lives that different people are able or not able to lead in any society. These aspects of freedom can be captured better by a fuller use of the general capability approach, which concentrates on actual opportunities a person has to do this or be that, things that he or she may value doing or being. Obviously, the things we value most are particularly important for us, and it's very important that we succeed in achieving it. But the idea of freedom also respects our being free to determine what is it that we want, what to value, how we can reason about it, and ultimately what we decide to choose. It's easily checked that means such as income and other resources, while valuable in the pursuit of capabilities, are not themselves indicators of the capabilities and freedom that people actually have. The ability of a person to convert resources into capabilities depends on a variety of contingent circumstances. For example, the person's biological, physical, and mental characteristics, his or her proneness to illness, the physical and similarly disabilities, the physical, social, and epidemiological environment in which a person lives, and so on. The real opportunities that different persons enjoy are very substantially influenced by variations of individual circumstances, for example, age, disability, proneness to illness, special talents or lack of talent, gender and maternity, and so on, and also by disparities in the natural as well as the social environment and epidemiological conditions, whether you're, for example, in a malaria-infested area, extent of pollution, which affects the air and water that you can enjoy. Prevalence of local crime would be another consideration, which is very important for urban environment. Under these circumstances, an exclusive concentration on inequalities in income distribution cannot at all be adequate for an understanding of economic inequality itself, not to mention any other bigger value of inequality and equality. Valuing human freedom differs thus from focusing on income and wealth, which, oddly enough, Aristotle had noted more than 2,000 years ago in his book Nicomachean Ethics. And I quote from Aristotle, evidently, income and wealth is not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else, unquote. If we focus on freedoms, we would of course be interested in an income and wealth the persons respectively have. Inter alia, we must pay attention to it. And in other such means, captured within the broad category of what John Rawls calls, quote unquote, primary goods. But even though primary goods are important, ultimately we have to go beyond that and examine the actual freedom that people enjoy, depending on primary goods, including income, wealth, the social opportunities, personal features of individuals, the social features in which we live, the natural environment which surrounds us, and all these considerations. They are all part of our critical examination about which reasoning can take place. I end my brief presentation by referring to a classic distinction between two concepts of justice emphasized in ancient Indian jurisprudence, which contrasts the Sanskrit words niti and nyaya. Sanskrit has about 20 words for justice, but niti and nyaya are two primary ones here. Among principal users of the term niti, seen as justice, are organizational propriety, behavioral correctness, and legalistic justification. And that comes very close to the institutional perspective that I was discussing earlier. In contrast with niti, the term nyaya stands for a comprehensive concept of realized justice. In that line of vision, the roles of institutions, important as they are, of rules, organization, all of them are important as they are, but they have to be put in a wider context and have to be assessed in the broader and more inclusive perspective of realized justice, which is inescapably linked with the world that actually emerges, not just the institutions or rules that are there in order to facilitate the emergence of what is thought to be the appropriately defined world. Let me consider an example to make the distinction between niti and naya clearer. Ferdinand I, the Holy Roman Emperor, famously claimed in the 16th century, fiat justitia et periat mundus, which can be translated as, I quote, let justice be done, though the world would perish, unquote. This severe maxim could figure as a niti, a very austere niti, doing the right thing even if the world perish, that is advocated by some, indeed Ferdinand I did just that, but it would be hard to accommodate a total catastrophe, the world perishing, as an example of a just world when we understand justice in the broader form of naya. If indeed the world does perish, there would be nothing much to celebrate in that accomplishment, even though the stern and severe niti leading to this extreme result could conceivably be defended with very sophisticated arguments of different kinds. The central recognition that is important is that the realization of justice in the sense of naya is not just a matter of judging institutions and rules, but of judging the societies themselves. And central to that judgment is the assessment of human life and freedoms in the societies that are involved. This is, of course, exactly where the capability approach has something to offer, and I'm delighted that it seems to resonate, it's my understanding is right, with the very gorgeously broad perspective for which this university stands, of which the 25th anniversary we are all celebrating. I feel thrilled to be here. So I end by thanking our hosts for the honor they're bestowing on us, and congratulating also for 25 years of glorious existence. And I feel in favor, on behalf of the other honorary graduates too, feel very privileged indeed to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Today, this formal part of the celebration has come to an end. I will not take long to explain what will happen now. We are going to the Senaatzaal to really celebrate and to join together, to talk to each other, to drink a little bit, to get new acquaintances, maybe to network a little bit. We go back the way we came in, which means that I will start a procession with Professor Sen. Everyone will join in. After the cortege, then the first rows are asked to join us, the second row, the third row, etc., etc. It's possible that you will be halted at the door, because there's also a little photo moment, as it is called. But we try to be very, very fast, because I think we are all very thirsty. I'll see you later. And it's like what the VSNU director always says, horeca est.